In the summer of 1979, a Sony executive stood in a boardroom in Tokyo and put his own job on the table. If the strange little gadget his engineers had just built didn't sell, he would resign. His own marketing team had already told him it would flop. Their research was blunt. Nobody wanted a tape player that couldn't record. Retailers laughed at it. And almost everyone inside the company quietly agreed the whole thing was a mistake. That gadget was the Walkman. It went on to sell more than 400 million units and rewire how the entire planet listens to music. So how did the invention everyone voted against become one of the most successful products ever made? If you've ever gone for a run with headphones in, or built your whole morning commute around a single playlist on the train, you are living inside something this little silver box quietly started. So before we get to the boardroom showdown, stay with me, because the part almost nobody tells you is just how close the Walkman came to never existing at all. To understand why this gamble was so terrifying, you first have to understand what Sony actually was in 1979. The company had been founded back in 1946, in the rubble of post-war Japan by two men, a brilliant soft-spoken engineer named Masaru Ibuka and a sharp, charismatic businessman named Akio Morita. They started in a bombed-out department store with almost nothing. But over the next 3 decades, that tiny workshop grew into a global symbol of Japanese ingenuity. Sony gave the world the pocket transistor radio. It gave the world the Trinitron television, with a picture so crisp it set the standard for an entire industry. By the late 1970s, the Sony name on a product meant precision, quality, and the future. So when the chairman of that company stood up and announced he was betting everything on a cassette player that couldn't even record, the stakes were not just financial. The reputation of one of the most admired companies on earth was riding on a hunch. But the story doesn't actually begin with a marketing meeting or a focus group. It begins with an old man who simply wanted to listen to music on a plane. By 1979, Masaru Ibuka was getting on in years, and he traveled constantly, taking long trans-Pacific flights back and forth between Tokyo and the United States. Ibuka loved music, opera especially, and he was tired of sitting through those endless hours in the air in complete silence. Sony already made a portable tape player called the TCD5, and it was a beautiful machine, but it had been built for professionals. It cost around $1,000, it was heavy and bulky, and dragging it onto a plane just to listen for pleasure felt almost absurd. So Ibuka asked his people a very simple question. Why couldn't they build him something small enough to carry around? Nothing fancy. No bells, no whistles, just music in his ears on a plane. That request landed at an unusual moment inside the company. The head of Sony's audio division, Norio Oga, was actually lying in a hospital bed at the time, recovering from a broken back after a helicopter crash. From that hospital room, Oga passed Ibuka's request down the chain to Kozo Oson, the general manager who ran the tape recorder division. And this is where the engineering gets genuinely clever. Oson's team did not try to design anything from scratch. Building a brand new device would have taken months, and a fragile prototype that broke down in front of the bosses would have been a disaster. So instead, they grabbed an existing product right off the shelf. A chunky little mono cassette recorder called the Pressman, originally designed for journalists to record interviews out in the field. Then they started taking things away. Out came the recording mechanism. Out came the built-in speaker. And in their place, the engineers carefully wired in a stereo amplifier and a jack for a pair of lightweight headphones. The entire modification took them about 4 days, and then they pressed play. What came out of those headphones stopped the engineers in their tracks. The sound was rich and full, proper stereo, the kind of audio you would normally only expect from a large system sitting in someone's living room. Except now it was pouring out of a battery-powered box small enough to hold in one hand. You really have to remember what 1979 actually sounded like to appreciate this. If you wanted to hear music, you had basically 3 options. You sat in front of a stereo system at home, you turned on the radio in your car, or you hauled a heavy boombox up onto your shoulder and shared your music with the entire street, whether they wanted it or not. Music back then was a thing that happened in a room or out loud around other people. The idea of a private wall of sound just for you, sealed inside your own head while you walked down a busy road, simply did not exist anywhere on the planet. Nobody had ever felt it. So when Ibuka slipped those headphones on, he was genuinely thrilled. When Ibuka returned home from his trip, he handed the makeshift player to the one man inside Sony who could turn a rough prototype into a real product. Akio Morita, the chairman. Now, Morita was not a typical engineer who happened to run a company. He was a showman and a marketer at heart, a man who understood people far better than he understood spec sheets. Decades later, people would call him a kind of Steve Jobs before Steve Jobs, and that is almost exactly backwards, because Jobs was the one who idolized Morita. Morita took the little player home for the weekend and ran his own version of market research. He handed it to his golf buddies, he passed it around his family, and he watched their faces very carefully. Every single person had the exact same reaction the engineers had. That flash of surprise, then delight, then a quiet refusal to take the headphones off and hand the thing back. Morita walked into the office on Monday completely convinced. His gut was screaming that this was going to be enormous. There was only one problem. Almost nobody else at Sony agreed with him. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. Because the moment Morita tried to push his weekend toy toward becoming an actual product, the entire company seemed to line up against him. Start with the engineers. A tape player that couldn't record struck them as broken right out of the gate. Recording was the whole point of owning a cassette machine in the first place. Stripping it out felt like trying to sell a car with no reverse gear. Then came the marketing department, and they came armed with research. Their data said two things, and both of them were bad. First, consumers would never pay good money for a tape deck that only played music back and couldn't capture it. And second, people would be annoyed and even embarrassed by having to wear headphones in public, walling themselves off from everyone around them. The retailers Sony spoke to were just as doubtful. They simply could not picture who on earth would actually buy this thing. And worst of all, even some of the engineers who had built the prototype with their own hands quietly wondered whether anyone outside the lab would ever truly care. And the raw numbers only made the case against it look even worse. At the price Sony needed to charge to keep the product affordable, the factory had to move 30,000 units just for the thing to make basic financial sense. On paper, for a company the size of Sony, that should have been routine, except it wasn't. No Sony tape deck in the entire history of the company had ever sold more than 15,000 units. Not one, so Morita was not quietly betting on a small safe success. He was betting that a recordless, headphone-only, never-been-tried gadget would more than double the best sales result his division had ever produced in its life. The pushback in those meetings got so loud and the doubt so heavy that Morita finally did the thing executives almost never dared to do. He laid his entire career on the line. He told the room flatly that if Sony failed to sell that first run of 30,000 units by the end of the year, he would step down from his position at the company he had spent his whole life building. And he never once wavered. Years later, when people asked how he could possibly have been so certain when every piece of research pointed the other way, Morita answered in just a few words. "I just knew," he said. He didn't believe any amount of market research could have predicted what was about to happen. But before this thing could sell a single unit, it needed a name, and even that small detail nearly went off the rails. Sony's team over in America had a suggestion they were genuinely excited about. Disco was everywhere in 1979, and jogging had become the fashionable new craze, sweeping the country, so they wanted to call the device the Disco Jogger. Morita killed that idea on the spot. He worried that the word disco would brand the product as something young and trendy, and that it would scare off older buyers. He wanted absolutely everyone reaching for this thing, every single age group, not just teenagers on roller skates. Since the company already had that recorder called the Pressman, and this new device was made for listening while you walked around, Oson tossed out another idea. Walkman. The other executives weren't exactly thrilled with the slightly broken English of it. But nobody could come up with anything better, so the name stuck, at least in Japan. Overseas, Sony got nervous about the grammar and actually split the name 3 different ways. In the United States, it launched as the Soundabout. In Britain, it became the Stowaway. And in Sweden, of all places, it was sold as the Freestyle. It would take another year before Morita finally put his foot down and declared that the whole world would call it one thing: Walkman. On July 1st, 1979, the very first Walkman went on sale. The official model number was the TPS-L2, a small blue and silver box, with not one but two headphone jacks built in, because Morita figured people would want to share the experience with a friend walking beside them. It weighed about as much as a paperback book, came with a pair of Featherlight headphones, and sold for roughly $150. And then, in that crucial first month, Morita's nightmares started quietly coming true. The thing barely moved off the shelves. Reports from that first July put the sales at only around 3,000 units. The press coverage was lukewarm at best. That exact confusion the marketing team had warned about, a tape player that can't record, so what on earth is the point of it, was bleeding straight into the public mind. For several long, agonizing weeks, it genuinely looked like every single doubter had been completely right, and the chairman who had promised to resign had just made a catastrophic, career-ending bet in front of his entire company. But here is the detail that almost everyone missed at the time. The Walkman wasn't failing because people disliked it. It was failing because no advertisement on earth could possibly explain what it actually felt like. You simply could not put into words the sensation of sealing yourself inside your own private soundtrack as you moved through the world. You had to slip the headphones on and hear it for yourself just once. So Sony's marketing team threw out the rulebook and got physical. Instead of buying more print ads, they sent Sony employees straight out into the streets of Tokyo. Staff members rode the crowded commuter trains and walked through packed shopping districts like Ginza on the weekends, carrying Walkmans and simply offering the headphones to curious strangers. Just try it, they would say. Just listen for 1 second. They recruited well-known Japanese celebrities to appear in the print campaigns. And in one of the most famous demonstrations of all, Sony put a Walkman on a skateboarder, gliding smoothly through the city with music in his ears and a grin on his face, capturing the entire point in a single moving image. This was music that could finally travel with you wherever you went. And it worked! The instant people heard it with their own ears, the resistance just melted away. If you're enjoying this breakdown of how one stubborn bet quietly rewired the modern world, take a second to subscribe, because this channel digs into the buried stories behind the everyday products you never stop to think about. By September of 1979, only 3 months after that humiliating opening month, the entire first run of 30,000 units had completely sold out. Morita's job was safe, and his impossible bet had paid off. But that was only the opening act. Demand didn't merely recover, it absolutely exploded. Within about 5 months, Sony's factories back in Japan physically could not keep up with the orders flooding in. Store shelves were running dry. The product was constantly, frustratingly out of stock. Word of mouth was doing what no advertising budget on earth ever could, because the Walkman sold itself the very moment one person handed the headphones to another. Tourists visiting Japan started snapping them up as gifts to carry back home, and suddenly the demand wasn't just Japanese anymore. The little gadget that the entire company had voted against had somehow become the one thing everyone seemed to need to own. And here's a piece of the magic that often gets overlooked. The Walkman didn't just need a clever player, it needed a new kind of headphone. Before this, headphones were big, heavy, padded things that clamped down on your skull, fine for sitting still in a studio but miserable for walking around all day. So Sony's engineers developed a pair of ultra-lightweight headphones to go with the device, weighing barely more than an ounce, light enough that you could honestly forget they were even there. That tiny detail mattered enormously. The featherweight headphones were what made the whole experience feel effortless instead of like wearing a piece of equipment. There was even a small orange button on the side of that first model, a so-called hotline button, that let two people sharing the device lower the music and talk to each other for a moment without taking the headphones off. It tells you everything about how carefully this product had been thought through, by a team that had been told the whole idea was pointless. And once the world saw how much money Sony was making, the imitators came fast. Within a couple of years, nearly every electronics company on the planet was rushing out its own version of a portable cassette player. But it didn't matter. Sony had moved first, moved hardest, and stamped its name on the entire category. People didn't ask for a portable stereo. They asked for a Walkman, even when the box in their hand said something else entirely. And what happened next went far, far beyond sales charts, because the Walkman didn't just sell well, It quietly rewired how human beings move through the world. For the first time in all of history, an ordinary person could carry a personal soundtrack with them absolutely everywhere they went. The morning commute stopped being dead, empty time and started becoming your time. A boring walk to the train station turned into a scene from your own private movie, scored to whatever you wanted. People could build an invisible bubble in the middle of a packed subway car, fully present in their bodies but somewhere else entirely inside their heads. Some critics genuinely hated this. They worried an entire generation was sealing itself off from real life, ignoring the people standing right next to them behind a wall of headphones, lost in their own little worlds. Sound familiar? But people loved the freedom far too much to listen to any of the complaints. The cultural footprint grew so enormous that by the mid-1980s, the word Walkman was officially added to the Oxford English Dictionary. Think about what that means for a second. A brand name had quietly become the actual word for the entire concept of personal portable music. The product hadn't just won the market, it had won the language. The change ran even deeper than the dictionary though. Researchers and writers started giving it a name, the Walkman effect, to describe the strange new way people were experiencing the world around them. A city street had always been a shared, noisy public place. Now millions of people were walking through that same street with their own private soundtrack playing, turning the ordinary world outside into something that felt almost cinematic. The same gray sidewalk could feel triumphant or melancholy or thrilling, depending entirely on what was playing in your ears. People began choosing music not just for how it sounded, but for how it made the walk to work feel. For the first time, you could score your own life like a film director, in real time, just by pressing play. Some people found that liberating beyond words. Others found it slightly unsettling, the sight of a crowd of strangers all physically together, yet each sealed inside a separate world of sound. Either way, that behavior never went away, it only spread. Every time you put your earbuds in to walk somewhere today and feel the day rearrange itself around the music, you are repeating a habit that did not exist before one stubborn man overruled his entire company in 1979. Now here is the part that connects this 1979 gamble directly to the device that is almost certainly somewhere within arm's reach of you right now. The Walkman didn't stop at selling out one production run. It just kept going and going and going. Sony extended the brand into the Discman for compact discs in the 1980s, then onward into mini disc players, and eventually into early digital music players. By the year 2000, more than 200 million Walkmans had been sold all around the world, and across the full lifespan of the brand, that staggering number eventually climbed past 400 million units. But maybe the single biggest legacy isn't the sales figure at all. It's who was quietly watching from across the ocean. A young Steve Jobs was completely obsessed with Sony, and with Akio Morita in particular. By some accounts, Jobs got hold of an early Walkman and took it apart piece by piece, just to study how every single component had been fitted together so perfectly. He didn't want to copy Sony's products, he wanted to be Sony. And decades later, when Apple finally released the iPod with its famous promise of 1,000 songs in your pocket, it was walking straight through a door the Walkman had kicked wide open 20 years earlier. The entire idea that your music belongs to you, lives with you, and travels everywhere you go traces directly back to that recordless little box that Sony's own people had tried so hard to kill. Every streaming app, every pair of wireless earbuds, every teenager lost in a playlist on a crowded bus is in a very real sense a descendant of that one device. There's a quiet, almost painful irony in how it all ended. The very company that invented personal portable music would later stumble badly in the digital age, watching Apple seize the future. Sony had practically handed it on a silver platter. But that takes nothing away from the original miracle. Akio Morita died in 1999, right at the moment personal music was about to make its great leap from tape to digital, from the Walkman to everything that followed. He had spent his entire life insisting on one stubborn idea, that customers don't always know what they want, and that it is the inventor's job to show them what is even possible. The Walkman was the purest proof he ever offered. A product the experts rejected, the research flatly condemned, and his own company practically begged him to abandon. And it went on to teach the entire world a brand new way to live, to walk, and to listen. If you want to see how another product that everyone once laughed at went on to quietly take over the entire planet, the video on screen breaks down exactly that story. Go watch it next.